Hello over the peak, Thursday's World Economic News, starting with a chart from Gavin Davis's blog in the FT, the US and Italy, two candidates for default. You can see the 10-year bond for Italy going up and the 10-year bond for the United States going down, representing the belief by the market, whoever that is, that the US will pull away from the lunacy of the debt ceiling catastrophe, and Italy might come under the influence of European politicians' incompetence. The meeting on Thursday is to sort out Greece, when the main problem now is Italy and Spain, but Italy and Spain can be put off for a moment if the European politicians deal extremely equitably, decently and rationally with Greece. That's a big ask. So, Gavin says, from the article, another case in point is the US. Yes, the debt ratio is high at almost 100% of GDP, and there is no credible medium-term plan to bring it down. But the immediate fear of default is the result of a political standoff between the two parties in Washington and nothing much else. Provided that there is a last-minute outbreak of sanity and the US debt ceiling is raised, a US sovereign debt crisis still seems to be improbable, at least for now. In fact, as Paul Krugman has been emphasizing, the economy is continuing to weaken and inflation may have peaked. This explains why bond yields have simply refused to rise in the manner predicted by some pessimists in the market. The Fed has ended QE2, but this has made no difference. Deflationary forces still in the United States. But in present circumstances, Italy is more likely to be heading towards deflation than inflation. So deflation as well in Italy. So bond yields would probably not be as sensitive to inflation risk as they are to default risk. This is quite an important point brought out in this blog posting if you want to follow the link. The market, he says, looked upon sovereign debt as risk. Now the market is analysing closer and analysing it into how much inflation risk and how much default risk, and then balancing, weighing the two up. A case in point is the UK, where the currency has been devalued. Inflation has risen, but bond yields have so far remained low. The government's fiscal tightening has clearly helped to maintain confidence, but so has the absence of any default risk, given that the UK has an independent central bank. So the default risk in the United States and the United Kingdom is low because they have central banks that can ka-ching up money, but inflation risk is to be taken into account, and it's decided that there isn't a high inflation risk in the United States, and the inflation risk in the UK is now dropping off. So gilts, those are UK bonds, are okay for the moment because there is no default risk and no great inflation risk. But for Italy, there is default risk because they do not have a central bank, and there is also some inflation risk, but also a countervailing deflation. So the real risk for Italy is default. It's tricky, but this is what these people in suits have to work out. Anyway, better get on with it. How much time have we got? Not much. Another article in the FT. As recently as a month ago, it appeared that a second bailout of Greece would be a relatively straightforward affair. As with previous rescues cobbled together by the European Union and its lending partner, the IMF, Staff economists would estimate Athens' financing hold over the next 3 years, about 115 billion euro, agree a reform programme with the government and start writing cheques. No worries. But instead, European leaders have been drawn into one of the most agonised debates since the Eurozone debt crisis erupted nearly 2 years ago. It has sown confusion in financial markets and pushed borrowing costs for the third and fourth largest Eurozone economies, Italy and Spain, to 6%, levels some analysts believe are not sustainable. Indeed, they aren't sustainable. The conflicting problems are compounded by conflicting institutions. Almost every participant in the debate, Athens, the European Central Bank, the IMF, the European Commission, and national capitals, hold different and sometimes mutually exclusive interests. The Frankfurt-based ECB, for instance, is responsible for making sure Europe's banking sector remains solvent. But the sector, as well as the ECB itself, holds vast quantities of peripheral bonds, meaning any undermining of their value could hit their capitalization levels, limiting their ability to survive a Lehman-like collapse. The German government, on the other hand, under pressure from the Bundestag, wants some of those banks to accept less than they were originally promised for their bond investment. It seems an easy problem. And the IMF have just written a frightening document that I'm going to push on and read some of. So Joseph Cottrell has pulled some stuff out of the IMF doc. On the second link, I'll link to the IMF doc. Both the Commission and the ECB considered that a sovereign default or a credit event would likely trigger contagion to the core euro area economies with severe economic consequences. Now that is heavy-duty talk from the IMF. Staff, however, also saw serious risks of contagion even under a strategy which tries to avoid default or credit events. So that means even at the Thursday/weekend conference, even if they get round trying to reduce Greece's debts by not causing a default, there still could be contagion to Spain and Italy. The crisis has changed a basic paradigm of the euro area, namely that all sovereign debt of euro area member countries is equal. This premise lost credibility in the eyes of market participants some time ago, with markets taking their cue from the discussion about the role of private sector involvement in the design of the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM that we talked of yesterday if you went there, and the permanent successor of the European Financial Stability Facility thing. Forget it. The Commission and the ECB shared the view that while the market discipline should be pursued, doing so in the midst of a sovereign debt crisis is poorly timed. In their view, such a shift could overburden a thinly capitalized banking system not yet completely ready to shift away from zero risk weight on sovereign holdings. And we've dealt with this over the last couple of days. I'll repeat that in black. In their view, such a shift could overburden a thinly capitalized banking system not yet completely ready to shift away from zero risk weight on sovereign holdings. In other words, if a knock on and contagion occurs, banks' books look very shabby. Let's move on because there's a lot to do. Also interesting, the ESM presents a first step towards a fiscal insurance scheme for the euro area. That's the IMF saying this, and I haven't heard anybody else say it. The ESM will provide support for countries facing sovereign funding pressures. Its final design and coverage should encourage prudent national policies while preserving financial integration of EMU and the attractiveness of its sovereign debt instruments, which is key for a large reserve currency. Eurobonds. Financial support under ESM should not be conditional on the debt restructuring and be conducive to continuing private sector engagement. I haven't got the time to explain it, but I went to some extent to explain that yesterday in Euro 4. The ESM could evolve into a European debt management agency if the political will were mustered for limited fiscal integration. Limited fiscal integration. I'd like to see the document on that. That included common bonds backed by enhanced euro area fiscal capacity. Eurobonds. Incidentally, fiscal insurance for a lot of IMF exposure, which is quite right. Debts are written on bits of paper. They're contracts that must be paid, inflated away, paid, or defaulted on. Bye.